Sometimes when life strips everything away, it's preparing you to find what was always meant to be yours. When grief becomes your constant companion, you discover that healing isn't about forgetting, it's about remembering who you really are. In the high desert of northern New Mexico, an Apache widow named Nalin stood before a crumbling adobe house that nobody wanted. The real estate agent almost felt guilty taking her 50 cents, warning her the place was fit only for rattlesnakes and ghosts. But Nalin saw something others missed. After burying her husband that winter, she had learned to look past broken surfaces. With 8-year-old Tazhi by her side, she began the slow work of making ruins into home. While she patched holes and cleared debris, her curious son explored every corner with a child's fearless wonder. Beneath the rotted floorboard, Tazhi discovered a wooden trapdoor that had waited over a century to be found. Inside lay Spanish silver, an antique rifle, and yellow documents bearing her great-grandfather's name. Proof that this land had always belonged to their family before it was stolen. The treasure's value exceeded $2 million, but would their small town allow them to keep what history had tried to erase? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nalin had always been a woman who understood the weight of silence. In the months since Joseph's funeral, she had grown familiar with the hollow echo of footsteps in an empty trailer, the way morning coffee tastes when there's no one to share it with, and how the television becomes nothing more than noise to fill the spaces where conversation used to live. The reservation housing where they'd spent 15 years of marriage felt more like a museum now, every corner holding memories that both comforted and cut. She remembered Joseph's hands, always busy, always building something. He'd been a carpenter by trade, but a dreamer by nature, talking late into the night about the land their people once called home. "My grandmother used to tell me stories," he'd say, his voice soft in the darkness of their bedroom, about a time when our families owned more than government housing and casino jobs. When we had real ground beneath our feet, those stories had planted seeds in Nalin's heart that grief hadn't managed to kill. Joseph spoke of his great-uncle, Standing Bear, who had owned vast stretches of New Mexico territory before the white man's lawyers found ways to make legal what was fundamentally theft. The old stories painted pictures of adobe houses with thick walls that kept the desert heat at bay, of gardens that bloomed with corn and beans, and squash, the 3 sisters that had fed their people for generations. Joseph's death had come without warning on a February morning when the reservation was locked in winter's grip. A heart attack at 42, the doctor said, probably brought on by years of stress and the kind of poverty that grinds down even the strongest men. One moment he was drinking coffee and reading Tazhi a story about coyote and rabbit. The next, he was clutching his chest and gasping for air that wouldn't come. The paramedics worked for 40 minutes in their living room. But some departures can't be delayed once they've begun. The funeral had filled the small reservation. Church with people whose faces reflected the same mixture of sorrow and resignation that seemed to mark every gathering in their community. Too many young men gone too soon, too many families learning to navigate loss before they'd had time to fully appreciate what they'd possessed. The burial took place on a hill overlooking the casino where Joseph had worked nights as a security guard to supplement his carpentry income. The irony not lost on anyone who understood how far their people's relationship with the land had fallen. 8-year-old Tazhi had inherited his father's quiet intensity and his mother's stubborn streak. Unlike other children who filled silence with chatter, he seemed to understand that some moments required reverence. He'd grown taller in the months since losing his father, not just in body but in the way he carried himself, as if grief had taught him lessons about responsibility that most boys his age never had to learn. When Nalin told him they were leaving the reservation, Tazhi simply nodded and began packing his few possessions into a cardboard box. His most treasured item was a photograph of his father teaching him to fish at the tribal lake, both of them squinting into the camera with matching grins. The boy wrapped it carefully in one of his father's old t-shirts, the cotton still holding the faint scent of sawdust and aftershave. The decision to leave hadn't been easy. The reservation was home to Nalin's mother, her 3 sisters, and a network of cousins who had helped raise Tazhi since he was born. But it was also the place where every corner held reminders of Joseph's absence, where well-meaning neighbors offered sympathy that felt more like salt in open wounds, and where the future seemed limited to variations on the same cycles of struggle that had defined too many generations. The 50 cents came from a coffee can Joseph had kept on their kitchen counter, his someday fund, he'd called it, filled with pocket change and dollar bills saved from lunch money. After the funeral expenses and the hospital bills, it was nearly all they had left. When Nalin saw the classified ad in the local paper, Adobe house for sale, as is, make offer, something stirred in her chest. That felt almost like hope. The drive to Esperanza took 3 hours through high desert country that seemed to stretch endlessly under a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Tazhi pressed his face to the passenger window of their ancient Ford pickup, watching the landscape change from reservation housing to small Hispanic farming communities to the more desolate stretches where only the hardiest plants survived. "It looks like Mars," he said, and Nalin had to agree. The red clay soil and sparse vegetation created an otherworldly atmosphere that was both beautiful and stark. Mesas rose in the distance like ancient monuments, their flat tops telling stories of geological time that made human concerns seem temporary by comparison. The house sat on 3 acres outside the small town of Esperanza, New Mexico. The name meant hope in Spanish, though the locals seemed to have forgotten that optimistic etymology somewhere along the way. When the real estate agent, a nervous young man named Danny Martinez, met them at the property, his expression suggested he was dealing with someone who had lost touch with reality. "Ma'am, I feel obligated to tell you that this structure is not habitable," he said, consulting his clipboard with the earnestness of someone who took his professional responsibilities seriously. "There's no running water, no electricity, and I'm pretty sure there's a family of coyotes living in what used to be the kitchen." The adobe stood like the bones of something magnificent that time had slowly dismantled. Walls 3 feet thick at the base had held strong in some places while crumbling entirely in others. Wooden vigas, the thick support beams, had survived better than the roof they'd been meant to hold up. Desert wildflowers and prickly pear cactus had taken root in what had once been interior rooms. Nature reclaiming space with the patient persistence that only the high desert could teach. But Nalin saw past the decay to the bones of the structure. Adobe was meant to last for centuries when properly maintained. The thick walls would provide natural insulation from the brutal summer heat and bitter winter cold. The layout followed traditional Spanish colonial design, rooms opening onto a central courtyard where families had gathered for generations to share meals and stories under the vast New Mexico sky. Walking through the ruins, she could envision how it had once been. The main room with its massive fireplace built into the north wall, designed to heat the entire house during winter storms. The kitchen with its horno, the traditional beehive oven where bread and pottery had been fired. Bedrooms arranged around the courtyard for privacy and protection from the elements. And everywhere, the sense of permanence that came from building with materials drawn directly from the earth beneath your feet. 50 cents, she told Danny Martinez, fishing the coins from her purse. "That's my offer." The young man looked at the change in his palm as if she'd handed him Monopoly money. "Ma'am, the asking price is $1,500 for a pile of adobe mud with no roof." Nalin shook her head. 50 cents is what it's worth to someone who can't see past what's broken to what could be. Danny made 3 phone calls to various supervisors before finally accepting her offer, probably more out of amazement than business sense. The paperwork took longer than the negotiation, and by the time Nalin held the deed in her hands, the sun was setting behind the Sangre de Cristo mountains, painting the ruins in shades of gold and amber that made them look almost whole again. The deed itself was a simple document, but holding it felt like holding a piece of the future. For the first time since Joseph's death, Nalin owned something that couldn't be taken away by bureaucracy or bad luck. The land belonged to her and Tazhi now, 3 acres of high desert that would be their foundation for whatever came next. That first night, they slept under the stars in what had been the main room, their sleeping bags spread on ground that generations of feet had worn smooth. Tazhi lay on his back, hands behind his head, studying the constellations with the focus of a scholar. "Dad used to say the stars were ancestors watching over us," he said, his voice small in the darkness. Nalin reached over and squeezed his hand. "They still are, mijo. They're all still there." She had learned to build fires from her own grandmother, who had grown up before electricity came to the reservation. The skill felt sacred now, this ability to create warmth and light from nothing but gathered wood and patience. As orange flames danced against the adobe walls, casting shadows that seemed to bring the ruins to life, Nalin felt something she hadn't experienced since Joseph's death, a sense of belonging. The town of Esperanza proper consisted of one main street lined with businesses that had seen better decades. Martinez Hardware still sold nails by the pound and kept coffee brewing for customers who wanted to solve the world's problems before lunch. The Esperanza Cafe served breakfast all day and dinner until 8, run by a woman named Rosa Sandoval, who knew everyone's order before they sat down. There was a small grocery store run by the Chen family, who had arrived from California 20 years earlier, a gas station with 2 pumps that had probably been modern in 1985, and a post office that doubled as the town's unofficial information exchange. The library occupied a converted house on 2nd Street, run by a retired teacher named Helen Morrison, who treated books like precious artifacts and children like potential scholars. She had created a reading corner specifically for young people, complete with bean bags and natural light that streamed through large windows. When Nalin brought Tazhi to register for a library card, Helen's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that books could be bridges to anywhere. Word traveled fast in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. By the second morning, Nalin couldn't walk into town without drawing stares and whispered conversations. The reactions ranged from pity to puzzlement to outright amusement. Here was this Apache woman with her quiet son, trying to live in a pile of adobe rubble like some kind of desert hermit. "That Indian woman's lost her mind," she overheard one customer tell Rosa at the cafe. "Living in those ruins with that little boy. Somebody ought to call social services." But Rosa, whose own grandmother had been Mexican Apache, simply refilled the coffee cup and said, "Maybe she knows something the rest of us don't." The local hardware store became Nalin's second home as she learned what supplies were needed for adobe restoration. Mr. Martinez, the owner, was Danny's uncle and initially skeptical about her project. But when she demonstrated her knowledge of traditional building techniques and showed him the quality of her first repair work, his attitude shifted from doubt to curiosity. "Your grandmother teach you this?" he asked, watching her test different clay mixtures for consistency. "My husband's grandmother," Nalin replied. "She said adobe was the most honest building material because it never pretended to be anything other than earth and water and human hands." Nalin spent her days learning the rhythms of restoration. Adobe repair was both an art and a science. Too much water and the mud wouldn't hold, too little and it would crumble before it dried. She mixed clay and sand and straw with her hands, feeling the texture tell her when the proportions were right. The work was backbreaking and meditative in equal measure. Each handful of mud a prayer for the future taking shape beneath her fingers. Tazhi became her eager apprentice, his small hands perfect for reaching into tight spaces and smoothing surfaces that her adult fingers couldn't access. He approached each task with the seriousness of someone who understood they were building more than just walls. They were creating home from the skeleton of history. In the evenings, after the sun had painted the western sky in shades of red and purple, they would sit in the courtyard and Nalin would tell him the stories his father had shared with her. Stories of Standing Bear, Joseph's great-uncle, who had been a leader among their people and a man white settlers had respected before politics, and greed made enemies of neighbors. Standing Bear was a bridge builder, she told Tazhi one night as they watched stars emerge in the desert darkness. He believed that honor was something you carried in your heart, not something others could take away from you. Even when they stole his land, even when they broke their promises, he never let them steal his dignity. These were the stories that had shaped Joseph's character, and now Nalin was passing them to their son, like a family heirloom more valuable than silver or gold. In the telling, she began to understand why this broken-down adobe house had called to her with such urgency. It wasn't just about having shelter. It was about reclaiming something essential that had been lost, about giving Tazhi roots that went deeper than government housing and casino employment. As the first month passed, their routine found its own rhythm. Mornings were for construction work, mixing mud and hauling stones, and learning the ancient patience that Adobe demanded. Afternoons belonged to practical concerns, trips to town for supplies, visits to the library where Tazhi could do homework and Nalin could research construction techniques. Evenings were for stories and stars and the growing sense that they were exactly where they belonged. The house was teaching them as much as they were rebuilding it. Every wall they repaired revealed something about the people who had lived there before. Adobe bricks made by hand, wooden pegs crafted by someone who understood that furniture should last for generations, and here and there, small treasures left behind by previous inhabitants, a ceramic button, a child's marble, a piece of pottery painted with geometric designs that spoke of artistic souls who had called this place home. Tazhi found most of these treasures, his young eyes sharper than his mother's when it came to spotting things that didn't belong among the adobe and sand. He kept them in a coffee can of his own, declaring them to be house memories that deserved respect and preservation. His favorite discovery was a wooden flute, carved from what looked like juniper, found wedged behind a loose stone in the north wall. "Someone made music here," he told his mother, turning the instrument over in his small hands. "Someone sat where we're sitting and played songs." Nalin tested the flute's voice and found it still capable of producing haunting notes that seemed to harmonize with the desert wind. In that moment, she felt the presence of all who had come before, Apache, Spanish, Mexican, and Anglo settlers who had loved this land enough to build permanent homes upon it. The house wasn't just their refuge. It was a repository of dreams that stretched back more than a century. Among the belongings they'd brought from the reservation was a weathered family photograph that Joseph had treasured. It showed a distinguished Apache man standing proudly beside an adobe house that looked remarkably similar to the ruins they now called home. The photograph was sepia-toned and cracked with age, but the subject's bearing was unmistakable. This was a man who belonged to the land he stood upon. "This is Standing Bear," Joseph had told her many times, pointing to the figure in the photograph. "This picture was taken right before they made him sell the land. Look at his face. He knew what was coming, but he never let them see him broken now." As Nalin studied the photograph by firelight in their partially restored home, she began to understand the deeper currents that had drawn her to this place. The adobe house in the background of the century-old photograph bore the same architectural details as their current home. The same arrangement of vigas, the same style of carved corbels, even the same distinctive curve to the front wall. Could this be the same house? Could Standing Bear have once called these ruins home? The possibility sent shivers through Nalin that had nothing to do with the desert's evening chill. If the photograph was telling the truth, then their 50-cent purchase had brought them not just shelter, but a piece of family history that had been lost for over a century. As autumn settled over the high desert, Their small adobe home began to look less like ruins and more like the sanctuary Nalin had envisioned. The roof was still a collection of tarps and salvaged metal, but the walls stood strong and the central courtyard had been cleared and leveled. They had created something beautiful from what others saw as worthless, and in doing so, they had created themselves anew. October had painted the high desert in shades of gold and rust when Tazhi made the discovery that would change everything. The morning started like any other, with Nalin mixing adobe mud in the courtyard while her son explored the house with the systematic thoroughness that had become his trademark. He had appointed himself the official finder of lost things, approaching each room like an archaeologist uncovering secrets that time had tried to bury. "Mama, this board sounds different," Tazhi called from what had once been the main bedroom. His voice carried the excitement of a child who had learned to trust his instincts about the house's hidden stories. Nalin wiped her muddy hands on her jeans and followed his voice to where he knelt beside the north wall, tapping a section of floorboard with the wooden handle of her hammer. The sound was indeed different, hollow where the surrounding planks rang solid against the packed earth beneath. "Stand back." "Mijo," she said, working the blade of her knife along the edges of the suspicious board. The wood was old but well preserved, protected by the dry desert air from the rot that would have claimed it in a more humid climate. As she pried carefully, the board came free to reveal not earth, but empty space. What they had found was a trapdoor, its hinges so perfectly fitted that over a century of settling had barely affected its operation. The wood was darker than the surrounding floor, stained with some kind of preservative that had allowed it to survive decades of neglect. Iron hardware, blackened with age but still functional, suggested this had been built by someone who understood that some secrets were worth keeping for a very long time. Tazhi's eyes were wide as dinner plates as his mother lifted the door completely, revealing a rectangular opening that descended into darkness. The space below was larger than either of them had expected, not just a simple hiding place, but a carefully constructed chamber lined with fitted stones and sealed against moisture. "Should we get a flashlight?" Tazhi whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow disturb whatever lay waiting in the shadows. Nalin retrieved their camping lantern from the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the flame. The steady glow pushed back the darkness to reveal a sight that made her breath catch in her throat. The chamber was perhaps 4 feet deep and 6 feet square, large enough for a grown man to climb down into if necessary. But it was the contents that made her heart race with possibilities she wasn't ready to name. Spanish silver coins lay scattered across the stone floor like fallen stars, their surfaces tarnished but unmistakably valuable. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, catching the lantern light and throwing it back in patterns that seemed to dance with their own inner fire. Some were loose, others bound in leather pouches that had survived the decades in remarkable condition, but the coins were only the beginning of what the chamber held. Wrapped in what appeared to be buffalo hide was a cavalry rifle, its brass fittings green with patina, but the weapon itself protected from the elements by whoever had taken such care to preserve it. The rifle was beautiful in the way that functional tools could be beautiful. Every line designed for purpose, every detail speaking of craftsmanship from an era when weapons were built to last generations. And beneath the rifle, rolled in oiled leather that had kept the desert's dryness from turning paper to dust, were documents. Official-looking papers with ribbons and seals, covered in the careful handwriting of government clerks who had probably never imagined their words would matter to anyone a century later. Nalin's hands shook as she lifted the first document into the lantern light. The Spanish was formal and flowery, but she could make out enough words to understand its significance. This was a land grant dated 1882, bearing the territorial seal of New Mexico and signed by officials whose names she recognized from history books about the Indian Wars, but it was the name on the grant that made her sink to her knees beside the opening, the document trembling in her grasp. Oso parado, Standing Bear in Spanish, followed by what appeared to be his English name written in a different hand. The land description that followed matched perfectly with the boundaries of their current property, along with thousands of additional acres that stretched north toward the mountains. "Mama, what does it say?" Tazhi asked, his young face serious with the understanding that something monumentally important was happening. Nalin's voice was barely a whisper. "It says this land belonged to your great-great-grandfather. It says Standing Bear was given this property by the United States government in recognition of his service as a scout and interpreter. It says—" Her voice broke as the full implications crashed over her like a wave. "It says this land was stolen from our family." The second document was in English, dated 3 years later, and its contents made Nalin's blood run cold. It was a deed of sale, supposedly signed by Standing Bear, transferring ownership of the land to one Elias Morrison for the sum of $50. But even Nalin's untrained eye could see that something was wrong with the signature. The handwriting was completely different from the careful letters Standing Bear had used to sign the original land grant. "Morrison," she said aloud, the name feeling bitter on her tongue. It was a name she recognized from around town. The family that owned the largest ranch in the county, the family that had been pillars of the community for generations. According to this forged document, their wealth had been built on land stolen from her husband's great-uncle. But there was more in the hidden chamber. A third document, this one written in Standing Bear's own hand, told a story that made Nalin's heart ache with anger and admiration in equal measure. It was a letter, apparently never sent, addressed to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. "They came in the night," the letter began, the English careful but clear. "3 men with papers they said I had signed. Papers that gave away the land your government promised would be mine forever. I told them I signed no such papers, that I would never sell the ground where my children were born. But they had a judge with them, and he said the papers were legal, whether I remembered signing them or not." The letter went on to describe how Standing Bear had been given 24 hours to leave the property he had received as payment for years of loyal service to the U.S. Army, how his protests had been ignored, his appeals to territorial authorities dismissed, his very existence as an inconvenience to be swept aside so that more powerful men could claim what was his. "I am hiding this record for my children's children," the letter concluded. "Someday, someone will remember that Standing Bear was a man of honor who kept his word even when others broke theirs. Someday, justice will find its way home." Tazhi had climbed down into the chamber while his mother read, his small hands reverently touching the silver coins as if they were sacred objects. In many ways they were, each piece of metal a fragment of a life that had been systematically dismantled by legal theft disguised as legitimate business. "Are we rich now, Mama?" he asked with the directness that only children possessed. Nalin looked at her son, surrounded by treasure that represented both enormous wealth and enormous injustice. "We were always rich, mijo. We just didn't know it yet." The Spanish colonial reales dated from the 1700s and early 1800s, probably accumulated over generations of trade and careful saving. There were American silver dollars from the Civil War era, Mexican pesos from before the territories changed hands, and coins from California that suggested Standing Bear had been far more cosmopolitan than local history remembered. But beyond their monetary value, the coins represented something more important, proof that Standing Bear had been a man of substance, someone who had participated in the broader economy of the American West rather than the simple reservation Indian that racist stories had made him out to be. These coins were evidence of dignity, of success, of a life lived with purpose and respect. As the full scope of their discovery settled over them, Nalin began to understand the choice that lay before her. She could quietly sell the treasure, take Tazhi somewhere far from Esperanza, and build a new life with money that would ensure they never wanted for anything again. It would be the practical choice, the safe choice, the choice that would protect her son from the battles that were sure to come if she chose differently. Or she could fight. She could take these documents to lawyers and historians and anyone who would listen, and demand that justice finally find its way home after more than a century of exile. She could risk everything they had built for the chance to reclaim not just land, but honor itself. Looking at Tazhi's face in the lantern light, seeing her husband's features reflected in their son's serious expression, Nalin knew there was really no choice at all. Standing Bear had hidden this evidence for his children's children, trusting that someday his sacrifice would be vindicated. That someday had arrived in the form of a widow and her boy, armed with 50 cents and the stubborn refusal to accept that broken things couldn't be made whole again. "We're going to keep it all," she told Tazhi, carefully replacing the documents in their leather wrapping. "And then we're going to make some people very uncomfortable." As they climbed out of the chamber and replaced the floorboard, Nalin felt the weight of ancestral responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar coat. She was no longer just a woman trying to rebuild a ruined house. She was the keeper of Standing Bear's legacy, the guardian of truth that powerful people had spent generations trying to bury. The battle for justice was about to begin, and this time the Apache would not be fighting alone. The Apache medicine pouch had been the last item they found in the hidden chamber, tucked beneath the rifle like an afterthought that wasn't really an afterthought at all. When Nalin untied the leather cords with reverent fingers, she discovered contents that spoke to her soul in ways the silver and documents could not. Sage that still held its sacred scent after more than a century. A piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a bear, an eagle feather wrapped in red cloth, and a small photograph of a woman whose eyes held the same determined set that Nalin saw in her own mirror. "This belonged to Standing Bear's wife," she told Tazhi as they sat in the courtyard that evening, the pouch resting between them like a bridge across generations. "Your great-great-grandmother. She must have prepared this for him before they lost the land." The photograph showed a woman in traditional Apache dress, but her pose was formal, European-influenced, suggesting she had learned to navigate between two worlds with the same skill that had made Standing Bear valuable as an army scout. Her face was beautiful, not in the delicate way that white society preferred, but with the kind of strength that came from raising children in a harsh land and standing beside a husband who walked daily between cultures that rarely understood each other. Holding the medicine pouch gave Nalin courage for what came next. The drive to the reservation took 3 hours, winding through high desert country that seemed to stretch forever under October's brilliant blue sky. She had called ahead to arrange a meeting with Thomas Crow Feather, the tribal historian whose memory held stories that had never been written down, whose understanding of their people's past went deeper than any government record or academic study. Thomas lived in a double-wide trailer that sat on a rise overlooking the valley where the tribal offices clustered like a small town. At 78, he moved with the careful dignity of a man whose body had earned its aches through decades of hard work, but whose mind remained as sharp as obsidian. His grey hair was pulled back in a traditional braid, and his hands were stained with ink from the typewriter where he spent his days recording oral histories before they could be lost forever. "Nalin Yazzie," he said when she knocked on his screen door, his lined face creasing into a smile that suggested he had been expecting her visit. "Joseph's widow. I heard about your Adobe house in Esperanza. Come in, child, and bring that boy of yours. We have much to discuss." The inside of Thomas's trailer was a museum of Apache history. Every wall was covered with photographs, documents, maps, and artifacts that told the story of their people's journey from the free-roaming days of the 1800s to the complex realities of modern reservation life. But it was the large map on his kitchen table that drew Nalin's attention immediately. A detailed survey of northern New Mexico from the territorial period, showing land grants and treaty boundaries in colors that had faded but not disappeared. "You've been researching Standing Bear," Thomas said, "and it wasn't a question." His finger traced a boundary line on the map that encompassed thousands of acres north of Esperanza. "Your husband used to come here asking about his great-uncle. Smart man, you're Joseph. He understood that our history doesn't begin and end with what the white man's books choose to remember." Nalin carefully unwrapped the documents they had found, spreading them across Thomas's table with hands that trembled slightly. She had photocopied everything at the library before making this trip, but bringing the originals felt necessary, as if Thomas needed to touch the same paper that Standing Bear had touched to fully understand their significance. Thomas's reaction was immediate and profound. His weathered hands moved over the land grant with the reverence reserved for sacred objects, his eyes taking in every detail of the Spanish text and the official seals that validated its authenticity. When he reached Standing Bear's letter, his lips moved silently as he read, and Nalin saw tears forming in the corners of his eyes. "I knew this story," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "but I never thought I would see proof. Standing Bear was my grandmother's brother. She used to tell me about the night they came to steal his land, how he hid these papers before they forced him to leave. She said he swore that someday justice would find its way home." The story Thomas told filled in details that the documents couldn't provide. Standing Bear had been more than just an army scout. He had been a diplomatic bridge between the Apache people and the territorial government, using his skills as a translator and negotiator to prevent conflicts that could have led to bloodshed on both sides. His reward had been the land grant, recognition for years of service that had often put him at odds with both cultures he served. He was a complicated man, Thomas explained, pouring coffee that was strong enough to wake the ancestors. Some of our people called him an apple, red on the outside, white on the inside. But my grandmother said he was playing a longer game, that he understood survival sometimes meant looking like you were cooperating while you were really preserving what mattered most. The Morrison family's role in the land theft was more extensive than Nalin had imagined. According to Thomas's research, Elias Morrison had been part of a systematic campaign to acquire Apache and Hispanic land grants through legal manipulation and outright fraud. He had worked with corrupt territorial officials to create forged documents, bribe judges, and intimidate native landowners into accepting pennies for property worth thousands of dollars. The Morrisons weren't just stealing from Standing Bear, Thomas said, spreading additional documents across the table. They were part of a network that stole from dozens of families. Your great-great-grandfather was just one victim of a much larger crime that nobody wanted to investigate too closely. But Standing Bear had been different from the other victims. His military service and his reputation as a negotiator had given him access to legal resources that most Apache people lacked. He had understood the importance of documentation, of creating paper trails that could outlast the men who created them. The hidden chamber had been his insurance policy, his way of ensuring that the truth would survive even if he couldn't protect it in his lifetime. What happened to him after he lost the land? Nalin asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Thomas's expression grew heavy with old sorrow. He never recovered from the betrayal. My grandmother said it broke something inside him, not losing the land so much as having his word questioned, his honor treated as worthless. He died 2 years later, some say from a broken heart. But before he died, he made my grandmother promise to remember the story, to tell it to her children and grandchildren, to keep the truth alive until someone could do something with it. Tazhi had been listening with the serious attention that had become characteristic of him since his father's death. Now he spoke for the first time since entering Thomas's trailer. "What can we do with it now?" Thomas smiled at the boy, recognizing something in his direct gaze that spoke of inherited determination. "Now you have what Standing Bear always hoped someone in his family would find, proof that cannot be ignored, evidence that even white courts will have to respect. The question is whether you're prepared for the fight that's coming." As they prepared to leave, Thomas gave them copies of additional documents from his personal collection, maps, surveys, and correspondence that would help establish the full scope of Standing Bear's original holdings. But more importantly, he gave them something that couldn't be copied or filed away in any courthouse. Standing Bear was a warrior, Thomas said, placing his hands on Tazhi's shoulders in the traditional gesture of blessing. Not the kind who fought with rifle and horse, but the kind who fought with patience and wisdom and the absolute certainty that justice would eventually find its way home. That warrior spirit lives in both of you now. Don't let anyone convince you to settle for less than what's right. The drive back to Esperanza felt different than the morning's journey. Nalin was no longer just a widow trying to rebuild her life. She was the inheritor of a sacred trust, the keeper of promises that had waited more than a century to be fulfilled. The medicine pouch rested on the seat between her and Tazhi, its ancient contents serving as a reminder that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. As their Adobe house came into view in the distance, looking more substantial now that she understood its true significance, Nalin made a silent promise to the photograph of Standing Bear's wife. The theft of their family's land had been legal by the standards of the time, but it had never been just. The time had come to demand that justice finally make its way home. The cavalry officer's journal had been wrapped in oiled leather at the very bottom of the chamber, as if Standing Bear had understood that this particular document would be the most dangerous to preserve. When Nalin carefully unfolded the leather binding 3 days after returning from Thomas Crowfeather's trailer, she discovered a brown leather-bound book filled with the daily observations of Lieutenant Colonel James Whitman Morrison. Dated 1885, the name Morrison made her blood run cold. This was no coincidence. James Whitman Morrison had to be an ancestor of the current Morrison family, probably the father or uncle of Elias Morrison, who had purchased Standing Bear's land. As she read the careful script that documented military operations in territorial New Mexico, a picture emerged of systematic corruption that reached far beyond simple land fraud. Standing Bear continues to be useful as an interpreter, though I suspect he understands more about our intentions than he lets on, read one entry dated March 15th, 1885. He has agreed to help us identify which Apache families hold the most valuable land grants. The man is either very naive or very clever. I have not yet determined which. By June of the same year, the journal's tone had shifted dramatically. Standing Bear has become problematic. He questions every transaction and insists on reading all documents before he will translate them for his people. Yesterday, he refused outright to help us approach the Chavez family about their holdings south of Esperanza. I believe he suspects what we are really doing here, but it was the final entries that provided the smoking gun Nalin had been hoping to find. He has completed the Standing Bear matter as we discussed. The forged signature is quite convincing. SB will never be able to prove he didn't sign those papers, especially since Judge Crawford is fully on board with our enterprise. The Apache's military service record works in our favor. We can claim he was confused about what he was signing due to his war injuries. SB will be given 24 hours to vacate, which should prevent any organized resistance from his supporters. The professional appraisal of the treasure had taken place the day before at a coin shop in Albuquerque, 60 miles south of Esperanza. The elderly appraiser, a soft-spoken man named Harold Chen, who specialized in pre-1900 American coinage, had handled each piece with the reverence of someone who understood that he was touching history. Your Spanish colonial reales alone are worth close to $800,000, he had told Nalin, his magnifying glass revealing details that spoke of centuries of careful preservation. These are museum-quality specimens, some of them dating back to the 1600s. The American silver dollars from the Civil War period add another 400,000, and the Mexican pesos from the territorial period are worth at least 300,000 more. But the cavalry rifle, a Spencer repeating rifle in near-perfect condition, had been the most surprising discovery. This particular model was only issued to senior scouts and officers, Harold had explained, running his fingers along the brass fittings with obvious admiration. The craftsmanship is exceptional, and the fact that it's been so well preserved makes it worth at least $500,000 to the right collector. Your total is looking at about $2.3 million, conservatively. The number was so large that Nalin had trouble processing its implications. $2.3 million was more money than most people in Esperanza would see in several lifetimes. It was enough to buy a house anywhere in the country, to send Tazhi to any college he wanted, to ensure that they would never have to worry about basic necessities again. But even as Harold Chen wrote out his official appraisal, Nalin knew that selling the treasure was no longer an option. These weren't just valuable antiques, they were evidence of a crime that had never been prosecuted, proof of an injustice that had been allowed to fester for over a century. Standing Bear had preserved these items not as an inheritance for his descendants, but as weapons in a war that was still being fought. Word had begun to spread through Esperanza about Nalin's activities, though she had tried to be discreet about her research trips and meetings with lawyers. In a town of 1,500 people, privacy was a luxury that few could afford for long. The reaction had been mixed, ranging from curious support to open hostility. At Martinez Hardware, where Nalin still bought supplies for the ongoing Adobe restoration, the atmosphere had grown noticeably cooler. Mr. Martinez was still polite, but his conversations had shortened, and his recommendations for building materials had become perfunctory rather than enthusiastic. Other customers seemed to find reasons to avoid the aisles where she was shopping, as if proximity to her might somehow implicate them in whatever trouble she was stirring up. The change was most noticeable at the Esperanza Café, where Rosa Sandoval had always greeted her and Tazhi like family. Now the older woman's smile seemed forced, and her usual warm chatter about local news had been replaced by efficient service that suggested other customers were waiting. Nalin understood the pressure Rosa must be feeling. In a small town, taking sides could be expensive in ways that went far beyond money. It was during one of these increasingly uncomfortable visits to town that Nalin first encountered Buck Morrison directly. She was leaving the post office with Tazhi, when a large man in expensive boots and a pearl-snap shirt approached them with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Nalin Yazzie," he said, extending a hand that was soft, despite his obvious attempts to project rugged authenticity. "I'm Buck Morrison. I own the Circle M Ranch north of town. I've been hearing interesting things about your little research project." Buck Morrison was probably in his early 50s, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of wealth earned rather than inherited. His truck was a brand-new Ford F-350, with custom leather seats and enough chrome to blind an airplane pilot. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, calculated to convey strength without obvious intimidation. "I understand you've been looking into some old land records," he continued, his tone conversational but with undertones that made Nalin's skin crawl. "That's fascinating stuff, all that territorial history. My family's been in this area for generations. My great-great-grandfather was one of the original settlers. Maybe we should sit down sometime and compare notes about how this country developed." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Morrison was letting her know that he was aware of her investigation and that his family's deep roots in the community gave him advantages she couldn't match. But there was something else in his manner, a nervousness that suggested he knew more about her discoveries than he was admitting. "I appreciate the offer." "Mr. Morrison," Nalin replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "But I'm more interested in how the country was taken than how it was developed." The conversation lasted only a few more minutes, but by the time Morrison climbed back into his expensive truck, the lines had been clearly drawn. He had made his approach as the reasonable neighbor hoping to avoid unpleasantness, but Nalin's response had told him that reasonable compromise wasn't going to be possible. That evening, as she and Tazhi sat in their restored courtyard, watching the sun set behind the mountains, Nalin found herself thinking about the choice that lay ahead. She could still sell the treasure quietly, disappear to somewhere Buck Morrison's influence couldn't reach, and build a new life for herself and her son. No one would blame her for choosing safety over justice, particularly when the justice she sought was more than a century overdue. But every time she considered that option, her eyes fell on the photograph of Standing Bear's wife, whose determined expression seemed to ask whether the fight for honor was worth the risk to comfort. The medicine pouch that now rested on the mantel above their fireplace seemed to pulse with ancestral energy, reminding her that some debts could only be paid by the living on behalf of the dead. "Mama," Tazhi said, his voice cutting through her contemplation. "Are we going to fight the angry man with the shiny truck?" Nalin looked at her son, seeing Joseph's features, but also something that was uniquely his own, a strength that had been forged by loss, but not broken by it. "Yes, mijo," she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "We're going to fight him. And we're going to win." The next morning, she would call Maria Santos, the lawyer Thomas Crow Feather had recommended. The battle for Standing Bear's legacy was about to begin in earnest. And this time, the Apache would not be fighting alone. The Tribal Council resolution came on official letterhead that bore the seal of the Mescalero Apache Nation, its formal language carrying the weight of institutional authority that even white courts would have to respect. Maria Santos had suggested requesting tribal support as their first official action, understanding that any legal challenge would be stronger with the backing of a federally recognized government. The Mescalero Apache Tribal Council hereby recognizes the legitimate claim of Nalin and her minor son Tazhi to lands fraudulently taken from Standing Bear, Oso Parado, in 1885, the resolution read. Based on documentary evidence and testimony provided by tribal historian Thomas Crow Feather, the council finds that the original land grant was obtained through lawful service to the United States government and that subsequent transfer documents bear clear signs of forgery and coercion. Maria Santos was everything Thomas Crow Feather had promised, a Harvard-educated lawyer who had spent 15 years fighting cases involving Native American land rights, and who understood that legal victories meant nothing without the political will to enforce them. Her office in Santa Fe occupied the second floor of a historic Adobe building that had witnessed nearly 2 centuries of territorial and state politics. Its thick walls holding memories of every negotiation that had shaped the modern Southwest. "Your case is remarkably strong," Maria had told Nalin during their first meeting, spreading photocopies of Standing Bear's documents across her mahogany desk. "The original land grant is unquestionably authentic. I've had it examined by experts at the University of New Mexico Center for Southwest Research. The forged signature on the transfer deed is obvious to anyone with training in document analysis. And this journal from Lieutenant Colonel Morrison is essentially a confession to conspiracy and fraud. But legal strength didn't guarantee legal victory, particularly when the case involved land that had been legitimately owned by the same family for over a century. The Morrison family will argue that they purchased the land in good faith from someone they believed to be its rightful owner," Maria had explained. "They'll claim that even if the original transfer was fraudulent, the statute of limitations has long since expired on any claims against the current property holders. That's where the tribal resolution became crucial. As a federally recognized sovereign nation, the Mescalero Apache tribe had special standing in federal courts that individual claimants lacked. Their formal recognition of Nalin's claim transformed a civil dispute into a matter of tribal sovereignty and treaty rights, subjects that federal judges took much more seriously than simple property disagreements. "We're not just arguing that your family was cheated," Maria had said, her dark eyes bright with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a case she could believe in completely. "We're arguing that the systematic theft of Native American land grants represents an ongoing violation of federal trust responsibilities that has never been adequately Addressed, the tribal council meeting had taken place on a Tuesday evening in the community center on the reservation, a modern building that somehow managed to blend traditional architectural elements with the practical necessities of contemporary governance. The 7 council members had listened to Thomas Crowfeather's presentation with the serious attention that important business deserved, asking pointed questions about the evidence and its implications for other families who might have similar claims. The discussion had been conducted partly in English and partly in Apache, with Thomas serving as translator for points that didn't carry their full meaning in the colonizers' language. When the final vote was called, it'd been unanimous, 7 voices speaking as one in support of justice delayed but not denied. This isn't just about the Yazzie family, Councilwoman Sarah Bigay had said during the discussion period. This is about all of our families, all the land that was taken through legal tricks and government lies. If we can win this case, it opens doors for other families to reclaim what was stolen from them. But Buck Morrison's reaction to the tribal resolution had been swift and predictably hostile. Within 24 hours of its publication, Nalin had received a visit from the county sheriff, a soft-spoken man named Pete Valdez, who clearly wished he was anywhere else in the world. "I hate to bother you, Mrs. Yazzie," Sheriff Valdez had said, standing uncomfortably in the courtyard of her restored Adobe house. "But I've received a complaint about possible criminal activity on this property. Something about illegal excavation and removal of artifacts without proper permits." The complaint was obviously frivolous. Landowners had every right to excavate on their own property, and the artifacts they had found were clearly personal possessions rather than archaeological specimens. But frivolous complaints could still cause serious problems, particularly when they were filed by people with enough money to hire lawyers who specialized in making life difficult for anyone who opposed their clients' interests. "I understand this is probably nonsense," Sheriff Valdez had continued, his embarrassment obvious in the way he avoided making direct eye contact. "But I have to follow up on all complaints, even the ones that smell like harassment. Can you show me where this alleged excavation took place?" Nalin had shown him the trapdoor, now secured with a padlock she had purchased at Martinez Hardware, along with copies of the documents that proved her ownership of both the land and anything found on it. Sheriff Valdez had nodded politely, taken a few photographs for his files, and apologized again for the intrusion before driving away in his county-issued SUV. But the message had been received clearly. Buck Morrison was prepared to use every resource at his disposal to make her life complicated, and he had enough influence in the community to ensure that local officials would at least go through the motions of investigating whatever accusations he chose to make. The harassment had escalated from there with the kind of systematic precision that spoke of careful planning and abundant resources. The electricity to her property had been mysteriously disconnected twice, both times requiring service calls that ate up entire days and cost money she couldn't afford to waste. Her mailbox had been knocked down by what the Postal Service described as vandalism by unknown parties. Most seriously, someone had tampered with the propane line that fed her camp stove, creating a gas leak that could have killed them both if Tazhi hadn't noticed the smell during breakfast one morning. "This is getting dangerous." "Mama," Tazhi had said after the propane incident, his young face showing worry that no 8-year-old should have to carry. "Maybe we should go stay with Aunt Sarah until the court stuff is finished." But running away would accomplish nothing except proving to Buck Morrison that intimidation worked. Besides, leaving their land would mean abandoning the house that had become more than just shelter. It had become the symbol of everything they were fighting to preserve. "We're not leaving, Mijo," Nalin had told her son as they sat together in their courtyard, watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "This is our land, our home, our fight." Standing Bear didn't hide those documents so that his great-great-granddaughter could run away when things got difficult. The break-in had happened on a Thursday night when Nalin and Tazhi were in Albuquerque meeting with Maria Santos about trial preparations. They returned to find their front door standing open and the interior of their house systematically searched. Nothing had been taken. The hidden chamber remained undisturbed, and even valuable items, like their camping equipment, had been left untouched. But the message was clear. Buck Morrison knew exactly where they kept Standing Bear's treasure, and he wanted them to know that he knew. The intrusion felt more personal than theft, a violation of the sanctuary they had worked so hard to create from the ruins of abandonment and neglect. Standing in their ransacked living room, seeing their few possessions scattered across the floor they had so carefully restored, Nalin felt something harden inside her chest. This wasn't just about money or land anymore. This was about the right to exist without fear, the right to seek justice without being terrorized into submission. "They're scared," she told Tazhi as they worked together to restore order to their home. "Really scared. People don't do things like this unless they know they're losing." The next morning brought news that confirmed her analysis. Maria Santos called with information that changed everything. Her investigators had discovered that Buck Morrison's ranch was built on land that had never been legally transferred from the original railroad right-of-way grants. The Morrison family's entire empire might be built on foundations even shakier than she had dared to hope. The war for Standing Bear's legacy had escalated beyond anything Nalin had anticipated. But for the first time since discovering the hidden chamber, she felt genuinely confident that justice was finally ready to come home. Standing Bear's war lance had been the most carefully preserved item in the hidden chamber, wrapped in layers of buffalo hide that had protected its sacred decorations from the desert's relentless passage of time. When Nalin unwrapped it completely for the first time, she discovered not just a weapon, but a work of art that told the story of a warrior's spiritual journey through symbols carved into ashwood and painted with pigments that had somehow retained their original brilliance. The lance was 6 feet long, its shaft decorated with eagle feathers, beadwork in traditional Apache patterns, and strips of leather that bore the marks of ceremonial blessing. This wasn't a battlefield weapon. It was a symbol of leadership, the kind of lance carried by war chiefs and respected elders during the most important negotiations with enemy tribes and government officials. That Standing Bear had possessed such an item spoke to his status within Apache society, a status that white historians had systematically minimized in their accounts of territorial politics. "This lance says he was a war leader," Thomas Crowfeather had explained when Nalin brought photographs to show him, his weathered fingers tracing the sacred symbols with reverence. Not just a scout or interpreter, but someone who spoke for the people in councils of war and peace. The beadwork patterns tell his story. Here are the symbols for bridge builder. Here are the marks that show he spoke with the thunder beings. Here are the signs that he was trusted to carry messages between the living and the ancestors. The national media attention had begun with a single article in the Albuquerque Journal, but it had spread quickly through the networks of journalists who specialized in stories about David versus Goliath, particularly when David happened to be an Apache widow fighting to reclaim her family's stolen land. Within a week, reporters from Phoenix, Denver, and even Los Angeles had made the drive to Esperanza to interview the woman, who had bought a house for 50 cents and found evidence of a century-old crime. The story had everything that modern news editors loved: historical injustice, stolen treasure, legal drama, and a protagonist whose quiet dignity made for compelling television. Nalin had been reluctant to speak with reporters at first, understanding that media attention could complicate legal proceedings in unpredictable ways. But Maria Santos had convinced her that public opinion could be as powerful as legal precedent when it came to pressuring judges and politicians to do the right thing. "Your great-great-grandfather was silenced by powerful men who controlled the newspapers and the courts," Maria had argued. "But you have something he didn't. Have the ability to tell your story directly to people all across the country who understand what it means to fight for what's right." The interviews had been surprisingly easy once Nalin overcame her natural shyness about speaking to cameras. The reporters who made the trip to Esperanza were invariably sympathetic to her cause, perhaps because the evidence was so overwhelming that even the most objective journalists could see that a terrible injustice had been committed and covered up for generations. What would you say to people who argue that this all happened too long ago to matter now? A reporter from Denver had asked during an interview conducted in the courtyard of her restored Adobe house. "I would say that injustice doesn't have an expiration date," Nalin had replied, her voice calm but firm. "My son deserves to know that his ancestors were people of honor who kept their word even when others broke theirs. Every family deserves to know their real history, not the lies that were told to justify stealing from them." Buck Morrison's response to the media attention had been predictably aggressive. He had hired a public relations firm from Albuquerque to manage his side of the story, flooding local newspapers and radio stations with press releases that painted him as the innocent victim of a frivolous lawsuit designed to extort money from hard-working ranchers. "The Morrison family has been good stewards of this land for over a century," read one typical press release. "We've provided employment for hundreds of local families, supported community organizations, and maintained the agricultural traditions that built this part of New Mexico. Now we're being attacked by people who want to use century-old paperwork to destroy the legal stability that protects every property owner in the state." But Morrison's media strategy had backfired in ways his expensive consultants probably hadn't anticipated. The harder he pushed his narrative about being unfairly persecuted, the more attention the story received from national outlets that were drawn to conflict like moths to flame. Cable news programs began featuring debates between legal experts about Native American land rights, historical scholars about the systematic theft of indigenous property, and political commentators about the ongoing effects of colonialism in the modern American West. The harassment campaign against Nalin had intensified along with the media coverage, but it had also become more sophisticated and harder to trace back to its source. Her internet service had been mysteriously interrupted multiple times, always during periods when she needed to communicate with her legal team or research historical documents online. Deliveries to her property had been delayed or misdirected with suspicious frequency, including medical supplies that Tazhi needed for his asthma and legal documents that were supposed to arrive by certified mail. Most troubling had been the anonymous phone calls that began arriving at all hours of the day and night. The callers never threatened violence directly, but their messages were designed to create fear and uncertainty about her safety and her son's well-being. "You don't know what you're messing with," one typical caller had said, his voice disguised by electronic distortion. "Some things are better left buried, for your own good and your boy's good." Nalin had installed an answering machine to screen calls and had given the recordings to Sheriff Valdez, who had promised to investigate but admitted that tracing anonymous calls was difficult without federal resources that weren't available for local harassment cases. The pressure had begun to affect Tazhi in ways that worried Nalin more than any legal challenge or financial threat. Her normally resilient son had become withdrawn and jumpy, starting at unexpected sounds and asking repeatedly whether they were safe in their restored Adobe home. His schoolwork had suffered as his concentration flagged under the stress of living in a conflict zone that no 8-year-old should have to navigate. "Maybe we should just take the money and move somewhere far away," Tazhi had suggested one evening as they sat in their courtyard, his young voice carrying weariness that belonged on someone much older. "Somewhere the angry people can't find us." It was the moment Nalin had been dreading, the point where her son's well-being came into direct conflict with her commitment to seeking justice for Standing Bear's stolen legacy. The practical choice was obvious: sell the treasure quietly, disappear to some distant city where Buck Morrison's influence couldn't reach them, and build a new life free from the complications of century-old injustices. But looking at Tazhi's face in the firelight, Seeing Joseph's features mixed with her own stubborn determination, Nalin understood that running away would teach her son the wrong lesson about courage and integrity. She thought about Standing Bear's war lance, about the symbols that marked him as a bridge builder who never stopped fighting for his people's dignity even when the odds were overwhelming. "Your great-great-great-grandfather never gave up," she told Tazhi, pulling him close against her side. "Even when they stole his land, even when they called him a liar, even when he knew he might not live to see justice done, he kept fighting because he believed that someday his family would be strong, enough to finish what he started." The next morning brought news that would change the trajectory of their struggle in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Maria Santos called with barely controlled excitement in her voice. Her investigators had uncovered evidence that Buck Morrison's ranch was built entirely on land that had never been legally transferred from the original railroad. Right-of-way grants established in the 1880s. The Morrison family doesn't just have a questionable claim to Standing Bear's land, Maria explained, her lawyer's training unable to completely suppress her amazement. They have no legal claim to any of their property. Their entire ranch is built on federal land that was supposed to revert to the government when the railroad project was abandoned in 1923. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Buck Morrison, who had spent generations enriching himself through the theft of Native American land, had built his empire on property that his own family had never legally owned. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey he had been stalking was about to become his most dangerous predator. As Nalin hung up the phone and shared the news with Tazhi, she felt the spirit of Standing Bear's war lance calling to her across the decades. The time for defensive tactics was over. The time for attack had finally come. The railroad survey map had been buried in a filing cabinet at the State Land Office in Santa Fe, forgotten among thousands of other territorial-era documents that bureaucrats had been meaning to digitize for the past 20 years. Maria Santos had found it through the kind of methodical detective work that made her one of the most respected native rights lawyers in the Southwest, following paper trails that most attorneys would have abandoned as too time-consuming to pursue. The map was a revelation that changed everything about Nalin's legal position and Buck Morrison's vulnerability. Drawn in 1881 by railroad surveyors planning a line that was never completed, it showed the proposed right-of-way cutting directly through the heart of what was now the Morrison family's Circle M Ranch. According to federal railroad law, the government had granted the railroad company a corridor of land extending 50 feet on either side of the proposed track. Land that was supposed to revert to federal ownership if the railroad project was abandoned. The railroad project had been abandoned in 1923 due to engineering problems and cost overruns. But somehow the land had never reverted to government control. Instead, it had been quietly incorporated into the Morrison family's holdings through a series of transactions that bore all the hallmarks of the same kind of legal manipulation that had been used to steal Standing Bear's property 4 decades earlier. "This is bigger than we thought," Maria had told Nalin during an emergency meeting at her Santa Fe office. The railroad survey map spread across her desk alongside the other documents that were building into an overwhelming case for systematic fraud. Buck Morrison doesn't just have a weak claim to your family's land. He has no legal claim to most of his ranch. We're talking about thousands of acres that should belong to the federal government. Land that he's been using for cattle grazing and development without paying a penny in fees or taxes. The implications were staggering. If the railroad right-of-way claims were valid, Buck Morrison's family had been essentially squatting on federal land for a century, building their wealth on property they had never legally owned. The cattle operations that had made them rich, the development projects that had made them powerful, the political influence they had purchased with profits. From illegal land use, all of it was built on foundations as shaky as a house of cards in a windstorm. But the railroad map also revealed something else that made Nalin's heart race with possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. Standing Bear's original land grant, according to the territorial survey marks, extended far beyond the 3 acres where her Adobe house stood. The grant had included nearly 8,000 acres of high desert rangeland, mountain slopes rich with timber, and river bottom land perfect for agriculture. If the boundaries shown on the railroad survey were accurate, Standing Bear hadn't just been a modest landowner, he had been one of the wealthiest men in territorial New Mexico. Your great-great-grandfather was holding land worth millions of dollars even by 1885 standards, Maria explained, using a magnifying glass to trace the boundary markers on the century-old map. This explains why the Morrison family was so determined to steal it, and why they were willing to forge documents and bribe judges to get it. They weren't just stealing a homestead, they were stealing an empire. The discovery had come at the perfect time from a legal strategy standpoint. Buck Morrison's lawyers had been preparing to file motions arguing that even if the original land transfer had been fraudulent, the statute of limitations had long since expired on any claims against the current property owners. They would argue that a century of good faith ownership by the Morrison family had created legal rights that couldn't be challenged by descendants of the original victims. But if the Morrison family had never legally owned any of their land, then there was no statute of limitations to worry about. You can't claim ownership through adverse possession when you're squatting on federal property. And you can't argue good faith when your family's entire wealth is based on systematic fraud dating back to the 1880s. We've got them, Maria had said, her professional composure cracking to reveal the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered her prey. Morrison can't claim protection under adverse possession laws because he never had color of title to begin with. He can't argue that he's an innocent purchaser because his family has known about the fraudulent documents for generations. And he can't claim that the federal government abandoned its interests because railroad right-of-way grants never expire. They just sit there waiting for someone to notice them. The phone call from Buck Morrison had come that same evening, less than 6 hours after Nalin returned from her meeting with Maria Santos. The timing suggested that Morrison had sources inside the state land office who had informed him about the railroad survey research, which was both disturbing and illuminating. How many other government employees had been feeding information to the Morrison family over the years? Mrs. Yazzie, Morrison's voice had been smooth and reasonable, with none of the subtle intimidation that had marked their previous encounter. I think it's time we had a serious conversation about resolving our little disagreement. I'd like to invite you and your son to dinner at my ranch tomorrow evening. Just the 3 of us. No lawyers, no reporters, no outside interference. I think you'll find I can be quite generous when it comes to finding solutions that work for everyone. The invitation was clearly a trap of some kind, but it was also an opportunity to see how desperate Buck Morrison had become. A man who had spent months trying to intimidate her into submission was suddenly interested in negotiation, which meant he had learned something that scared him more than the prospect of paying fair compensation for stolen land. I appreciate the invitation, Mr. Morrison, Nalin had replied, her voice carefully neutral. But I'm more comfortable meeting in public places. How about we meet at the Esperanza Cafe tomorrow at 6 o'clock? Rosa makes excellent coffee, and I'm sure she'd be happy to give us a quiet table where we can talk. There had been a long pause before Morrison agreed to the counter-proposal, and Nalin could practically hear him recalculating whatever strategy he had planned for their meeting. Meeting in public would prevent any kind of direct threats or intimidation, and choosing the cafe owned by Rosa Sandoval, whose grandmother had been Mexican Apache, sent the message that Nalin wasn't without allies in the local community. The meeting had been surreal in its civilized hostility. Buck Morrison had arrived at the cafe wearing his best reasonable rancher costume. Clean jeans, pressed shirt, expensive boots that still managed to look like working gear rather than fashion statements. He had shaken hands politely, ordered coffee and pie like a man without a care in the world, and spent 10 minutes making small talk about the weather and local high school football before getting to the point. "I've been thinking about your situation, Mrs. Yazzie," he had said, stirring sugar into his coffee with the kind of deliberate attention that people used when they were choosing their words carefully. "All this legal wrangling must be expensive and stressful, especially with a young son to worry about. I'd like to propose a solution that would be beneficial for everyone involved." Morrison's offer had been breathtaking in its audacity. He was prepared to pay Nalin $5 million, more than twice the appraised value of Standing Bear's treasure, in exchange for her agreement to drop all legal claims against the Morrison family properties and to sign a confidentiality agreement that would prevent her from discussing the case with media or historians. $5 million would set you and your boy up for life. Morrison had continued, his tone suggesting that he was offering charity rather than attempting to buy his way out of criminal liability. "You could move anywhere you wanted, send Tazhi to the best schools, never have to worry about money again. All you'd have to do is acknowledge that sometimes old paperwork doesn't tell the whole story, and that good people can disagree about what happened in the past." The offer was tempting in ways that Nalin hadn't expected. $5 million was more money than she had ever imagined having, enough to ensure that Tazhi would have every opportunity that money could provide. It would mean an end to the harassment, the threats, the constant stress of living in a war zone created by powerful people who wanted her to disappear. But it would also mean betraying everything that Standing Bear had died protecting. It would mean teaching Tazhi that justice was for sale, that truth could be purchased by the highest bidder, that Apache dignity was worth exactly $5 million and no more. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Morrison," Nalin had said, meeting his eyes across the cafe table. "But I'm not interested in selling my great-great-grandfather's honor. Some things aren't for sale at any price." Morrison's mask had slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation underneath his reasonable facade. "Oh, you're making a mistake, Mrs. Yazzie, a very expensive mistake. I'm trying to help you here, but there are other people involved in this situation who might not be as understanding as I am." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, delivered in the same conversational tone he had used to discuss the weather. But Nalin had lived through enough hardship to recognize intimidation when she heard it, and she had learned from Standing Bear's example that showing fear only encouraged bullies to push harder. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Morrison?" she had asked, her voice loud enough to carry to other tables in the small cafe. Several locals had turned to look, their expressions curious about the sudden tension in what had appeared to be a friendly conversation. "Of course not," Morrison had replied quickly, his smile returning but looking strained around the edges. "I'm simply pointing out that legal battles can get complicated in ways that people don't always anticipate. Sometimes the best solution is the one that lets everyone move on with their lives, but the damage was done." Rosa Sandoval had heard enough of the exchange to understand that Buck Morrison was trying to buy Nalin's silence. And Rosa's grandmother hadn't raised her to stay quiet when powerful men tried to cheat Apache families. By the next morning, half of Esperanza knew about Morrison's $5 million offer and his poorly disguised threats. The revelation about the railroad right-of-way had reached Buck Morrison's ears within hours of Nalin's meeting with Maria Santos, confirming her suspicion that he had sources inside government offices who kept him informed about any research that might threaten his interests. But what Morrison didn't know was that Maria's investigation had uncovered something even more damaging than questionable land ownership. Hidden in the archived correspondence between territorial officials and railroad executives were letters that documented a systematic conspiracy to defraud the federal government of millions of acres of granted land. The scheme had involved dozens of families across New Mexico and Arizona, all working with corrupt judges and land office officials to create false ownership records for property that legally belonged to the United States government. The Morrison family hadn't just been participants. In this conspiracy, they had been its organizers and primary beneficiaries. Elias Morrison, Buck's great-great-grandfather, had served as the unofficial coordinator for the entire operation, using his connections in the territorial government to identify valuable railroad grant lands and his legal knowledge to devise schemes for transferring them to private ownership. This isn't just about your family's land anymore, Maria had explained during their follow-up meeting. We're looking at evidence of the largest land fraud conspiracy in territorial history, something that cost the federal government millions of acres and hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue. The Justice Department is going to be very interested in this case, especially since the statute of limitations never runs out on fraud committed against the federal government. The implications were staggering. If federal prosecutors decided to pursue the case, Buck Morrison wouldn't just lose his ranch. He could face criminal charges for conspiracy to defraud the government, charges that could result in decades in federal prison and the forfeiture of every asset his family had acquired through their illegal land schemes. But there was more. The railroad survey maps had revealed that Standing Bear's stolen land grant overlapped with property owned by at least 6 other prominent families in northern New Mexico, all of whom had acquired their holdings through suspiciously similar transactions in the 1880s and 1890s. If Nalin's case succeeded, it could trigger a cascade of similar lawsuits that would fundamentally restructure land ownership throughout the region. "You're not just fighting for your own family," Maria had said, her eyes bright with the excitement of a lawyer who had stumbled onto the case of a lifetime. "You're potentially fighting for dozens of Apache, Navajo, and Hispanic families who had their land stolen through the same conspiracy. If we can prove that the entire system of territorial land transfers was corrupted by fraud, we can start the process of returning stolen property to its rightful owners." The scope of what they were uncovering was both exhilarating and terrifying. Nalin had started out trying to reclaim 3 acres of desert land and a few rooms of Adobe ruins. Now she found herself at the center of a legal battle that could reshape the entire history of the American Southwest, forcing courts to confront the systematic theft that had shaped modern property ownership throughout the region. As she sat in her restored courtyard that evening, watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky, Nalin felt the weight of ancestral responsibility settling on her shoulders like Standing Bear's war lance. She was no longer just a widow trying to build a home for herself and her son. She was the keeper of secrets that powerful people had spent over a century trying to bury, the guardian of truth that could finally bring justice to families who had been waiting for vindication since the territorial period. The battle was about to escalate beyond anything Buck Morrison had anticipated. When he first tried to intimidate a grieving Apache woman into abandoning her inconvenient research, he had assumed he was dealing with someone who could be bought, threatened, or worn down by the superior resources at his disposal. He was about to learn how wrong he had been about the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose except honor itself. The sacred eagle feather had been presented to Nalin during a ceremony at sunrise on the morning before the final court hearing, given by tribal elders who understood that some battles required spiritual protection as much as legal preparation. The feather came from a golden eagle that had been found dead of natural causes on tribal land. Its death witnessed by Thomas Crow Feather during one of his morning walks through the mountains where his ancestors had once hunted. This feather carries the prayers of our people and the blessing of the ancestors, Elder Mary Begay had said as she tied the feather into Nalin's hair with strips of blessed leather. "Standing Bear's spirit will be with you in that courtroom, and all the voices of those who were silenced will speak through your courage." The ceremony had taken place in the courtyard of Nalin's restored Adobe house, with representatives from 3 different Apache communities joining Thomas Crow Feather and Maria Santos in witnessing the blessing. The presence of so many people who had driven hours to offer their support was overwhelming in ways that Nalin hadn't expected. She had begun this fight as a personal quest for justice, but somewhere along the way it had become something larger, a symbol of indigenous resistance that resonated far beyond her individual circumstances. The final preparations for the court hearing had consumed 2 weeks of intensive work that felt more like preparing for war than for a legal proceeding. Maria Santos had assembled a team of expert witnesses that included historians, document analysts, surveying specialists, and federal land law experts whose testimony would establish the overwhelming case for fraud that had been committed against Standing Bear and dozens of other families. But Buck Morrison's legal team had not been idle during the months since the railroad survey discovery. They had hired their own experts, filed dozens of procedural motions designed to delay and complicate the proceedings, and launched a media campaign that portrayed Nalin as an opportunistic fortune hunter trying to use sympathy for historical injustices to enrich herself at the expense of hard-working ranching families. Mrs. Yazzie claims to be seeking justice for her ancestors, read one typical press release from Morrison's publicity firm. But what she's really seeking is a multi-million-dollar payday based on documents that may or may not be authentic and legal theories that would destabilize property ownership throughout the American West. If her lawsuit succeeds, no landowner in New Mexico will be safe from similar claims based on century-old paperwork and questionable family stories. The strategy was clever in its cynicism, playing on deep-seated fears about property rights while avoiding any mention of the overwhelming evidence for systematic fraud that Maria's team had assembled. Morrison's lawyers understood that they couldn't win on the merits of the case, so they were trying to change the subject from what their client's family had done to what allowing Nalin's lawsuit to succeed might mean for other property owners. The harassment campaign against Nalin had also escalated in the weeks before the hearing, but it had become more sophisticated and harder to trace to its source. Someone had filed anonymous reports with Child Protective Services claiming that Tazhi was being endangered by his mother's obsession with the lawsuit, triggering investigations that were obviously frivolous but still required time and emotional energy to resolve. Her truck had been vandalized twice, both times in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of its mechanical vulnerabilities. The brake lines had been partially severed, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to create dangerous conditions during emergency stops. The fuel system had been contaminated with substances that caused the engine to run roughly and emit clouds of black smoke that made driving embarrassing and potentially unsafe. Most troubling had been the escalation in anonymous threats, which had moved from vague warnings about knowing what she was messing with to specific descriptions of what might happen to her and Tazhi if she continued pursuing the lawsuit. The callers seemed to know details about their daily routines that suggested they were being watched, information that made every trip to town feel like walking through a minefield of potential confrontation. They're getting desperate. Thomas Crow Feather had observed during one of his visits to check on their safety and morale. Desperate people make mistakes, but they also become more dangerous. You need to be extra careful in these final weeks. Sheriff Pete Valdez had been more helpful than Nalin had expected, perhaps because the media attention had made it politically impossible for him to ignore the obvious pattern of harassment. He had arranged for increased patrols around their property and had personally investigated the brake line sabotage, though his efforts to trace the threats and vandalism back to their source had been frustrated by the professional nature of the campaign. Whoever's doing this has money and connections. Valdez had told Nalin during one of his visits to take a report about the latest round of anonymous phone calls, the equipment they're using to disguise voices, the way they're avoiding security cameras, the knowledge they have about your schedule. This isn't some amateur operation run by local troublemakers, but the sheriff's most significant contribution had been his decision to investigate Buck Morrison's finances. following up on irregularities that Maria Santos had discovered during her legal research. What Valdez found was a pattern of suspicious transactions that suggested Morrison had been moving assets offshore and restructuring his business operations in ways that looked like preparation for major financial losses. He's been liquidating assets and transferring money to accounts in countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States. Valdez had reported to Maria Santos his law enforcement training, making him suspicious of financial activities that most people wouldn't recognize as problematic. That's not the behavior of someone who's confident about winning a lawsuit. That's the behavior of someone who's planning to run. The revelation about Morrison's financial maneuvering had prompted Maria to file emergency motions, requesting that the court freeze his assets pending the outcome of the lawsuit, arguing that there was substantial risk that he would attempt to hide or dissipate property that rightfully belonged to Nalin's family. The motion had been granted, creating a new level of legal jeopardy for Morrison and his co-conspirators. But Morrison's most desperate gambit had been his attempt to have the case moved from state court to federal court, arguing that the complexity of the land grant issues and the involvement of tribal sovereignty required federal jurisdiction. The motion was transparently designed to delay the proceedings and force Maria Santos to start over with a new set of judges and procedural rules. But it had been denied by a federal judge who recognized forum shopping when he saw it. Mr. Morrison's legal team seems to be under the impression that they can delay these proceedings indefinitely by filing frivolous motions and jurisdictional challenges. Judge Patricia Herrera had written in her order denying the federal transfer. This court is perfectly capable of interpreting territorial land grants and federal railroad right-of-way laws, and it intends to do so in a timely manner that serves the interests of justice rather than the convenience of defendants who appear to be more interested in obstruction than resolution. The media circus surrounding the case had reached fever pitch in the days before the hearing, with news crews from major networks setting up temporary camps in Esperanza and turning the small town into something resembling a movie set. The attention was flattering but exhausting, particularly since every reporter wanted to interview Nalin and Tazhi about their personal story, rather than focusing on the legal and historical issues that were actually at stake. This isn't about us, Nalin had told one persistent CNN reporter who kept pushing for details about Joseph's death and their struggles with poverty. This is about justice for all the families who had their land stolen through fraud and corruption. We're just the ones who happen to find the evidence that proves what everyone always suspected, but could never prove. But the media attention had also brought unexpected support from people across the country who understood that Nalin's fight represented something larger than a single family's quest for justice. Donations had poured in from Native American communities, civil rights organizations, and individuals who had been moved by the story of an Apache widow taking on a wealthy ranching family with nothing but 50 cents and the determination to honor her ancestors. The financial support had been practically helpful, but the moral support had been even more important. Letters arrived daily from people who shared their own stories of historical injustice, legal battles against powerful opponents, and the courage required to keep fighting when the odds seemed overwhelming. Many of the letters came from other indigenous families who had lost land through similar fraudulent schemes but had never had the evidence or resources to challenge the theft in court. "You're fighting for all of us," read one typical letter from a Navajo woman in Arizona whose great-grandfather had lost a ranch to suspicious legal maneuvering in the 1890s. Every family that was cheated, every community that was robbed, every ancestor who died knowing that justice had been denied, they're all counting on you to show that truth is stronger than money and power. As the morning of the final hearing dawned clear and cold over the high desert, Nalin felt the weight of all those expectations settling on her shoulders, along with the sacred eagle feather that would carry her ancestors' blessings into the courtroom. She was no longer just a widow trying to reclaim her family's stolen property. She was the voice of everyone who had been silenced by corruption and the hope of everyone who still believed that justice could triumph over greed. Standing in her courtyard as the sun painted the mountains gold and purple, surrounded by the adobe walls that had sheltered her family's secrets for over a century, Nalin felt Standing Bear's presence as tangibly as if he were standing beside her. The warrior spirit that had enabled him to survive betrayal and preserve truth for future generations was flowing through her veins, giving her strength for the battle that would finally determine whether honor was stronger than money. Today would be the day when justice finally came home. The judge's gavel was carved from New Mexico black walnut, a detail that seemed appropriate for a courtroom where the legal system would finally confront over a century of systematic fraud committed against the land's original inhabitants. Judge Patricia Herrera wielded it with the authority of someone who had spent 20 years on the bench dealing with complex property disputes. But she had never presided over a case with implications that reached so deeply into the foundational myths of American Western expansion. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching from adjacent rooms via closed-circuit television, and still more people gathered on the courthouse steps to await news of the proceedings. Representatives from Apache, Navajo, and Pueblo communities sat alongside investigative reporters, legal scholars and federal officials who understood that the outcome of this case could fundamentally reshape land ownership law throughout the Southwest. Buck Morrison sat at the defendant's table looking like a man who had aged 10 years in the past 6 months, his expensive suit unable to disguise the weight loss and stress lines that spoke of sleepless nights and increasingly desperate legal strategies. His team of lawyers filled 2 entire rows, their expensive briefcases and confident demeanor suggesting the kind of legal firepower that money could buy, but not necessarily the kind of moral authority that would sway a judge who had built her reputation on scrupulous attention to evidence and precedent. Maria Santos approached the plaintiff's table with the measured confidence of someone who had spent months assembling an airtight case, her presentation materials organized with the precision of a master craftsman displaying her finest work. Behind her sat Nalin and Tazhi, both dressed in their best clothes, but carrying themselves with the quiet dignity that had characterized their entire legal journey. "Your Honor," Maria began her opening statement, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "what we are going to prove today is that the Morrison family's wealth was built on a foundation of systematic fraud that began in the 1880s and has continued to this day. We will show that Standing Bear's land was stolen through forged documents, bribed officials, and a conspiracy that cost the federal government millions of acres and hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue." The evidence presentation took most of the morning, with Maria methodically walking the court through each document that proved the conspiracy's scope and sophistication. The original land grant, authenticated by 3 different historical document experts, established Standing Bear's legal ownership beyond any reasonable doubt. The forged transfer deed, analyzed by handwriting specialists from the FBI's document fraud unit, bore signatures that were obviously created by someone other than Standing Bear, but it was Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's journal that provided the smoking gun evidence of criminal conspiracy. As Maria read selected passages aloud, the courtroom fell silent except for the scratching of reporters' pens and the occasional gasp from spectators who were hearing the details of the fraud for the first time. "E has completed the Standing Bear matter as we discussed." Maria read from the journal's final entries. "The forged signature is quite convincing. SB will never be able to prove he didn't sign those papers, especially since Judge Crawford is fully on board with our enterprise." Morrison's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Blackwood, who specialized in defending wealthy clients against inconvenient legal challenges, attempted to attack the evidence on technical grounds. He argued that the journal entries were hearsay, that the document experts couldn't be certain about the age and authenticity of papers that had been stored in amateur conditions, and that even if fraud had occurred in the 1880s, the statute of limitations had long since expired, but Judge Herrera was having none of it. "Mr. Blackwood," she interrupted during his second hour of procedural objections, "your client's family has been in possession of property that, according to the evidence presented, was obtained through criminal fraud. The statute of limitations is irrelevant when we're dealing with ongoing possession of stolen federal property. Please address the merits of the evidence rather than continuing to raise objections that have already been considered and rejected." The testimony from Thomas Crowfeather provided crucial historical context that transformed the legal evidence into human story that the court could understand on an emotional as well as intellectual level. Speaking with the authority of someone who had spent decades preserving tribal history that others preferred to forget, Thomas painted a picture of Standing Bear as a complex figure who had tried to navigate between two cultures while maintaining his integrity and protecting his family's future. Standing Bear believed in the promises that the U.S. government made to him, Thomas testified, his weathered hands folding the eagle feather that he had brought as a symbol of his oath to speak truth. He served as a scout and interpreter because he thought cooperation and trust could protect our people better than continued warfare. The men who stole his land didn't just rob him of property. They robbed him of his faith in the possibility of justice. The railroad survey evidence, presented by a federal land law expert from the Interior Department, demolished any remaining doubts about the Morrison family's legal vulnerability. Not only had they built their empire on property stolen from Standing Bear, but most of their ranch was situated on federal railroad right-of-way grants that had never been legally transferred to private ownership. The Morrison family has been essentially squatting on federal land for over a century, the Interior Department expert testified, his bureaucratic language unable to disguise the magnitude of the fraud he was describing. They have used this land for cattle ranching, residential development, and commercial exploitation without paying a single dollar in federal lease fees or taxes. The total value of their illegal use probably exceeds $50 million in today's currency. As the morning's testimony concluded and Judge Herrera called a recess for lunch, Buck Morrison's face had gone gray with the realization that his family's carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him. His lawyers huddled in urgent consultation, their confident demeanor replaced by the kind of desperate strategizing that marked legal teams who had run out of viable options. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Nalin found herself surrounded by reporters asking for her reaction to the morning's proceedings, but she deflected their questions with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her entire approach to this battle. "I'm not celebrating anything yet," she told the assembled media. "Justice hasn't been served until Standing Bear's land is returned to his family, and the truth about what happened to him is officially recognized by this court. Everything else is just legal procedure." But privately, as she held Tazhi's hand and felt the weight of the eagle feather in her hair, Nalin allowed herself to believe that Standing Bear's long wait for vindication was finally drawing to a close. The land deed that Judge Herrera signed that afternoon was more than just a legal document. It was a formal acknowledgement that justice could triumph over corruption, even when the corruption had been protected by wealth and political influence for over a century. The parchment paper, specially ordered for important court decisions, bore the official seal of the Second Judicial District of New Mexico and the judge's careful signature that would restore Standing Bear's legacy with the full authority of American law. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented to this court," Judge Herrera announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "I find that the land grant issued to Standing Bear in 1882 was valid and legally binding, that the subsequent transfer documents were forged with criminal intent, and that the Morrison family has been in illegal possession of property belonging to the plaintiff's ancestors for more than 130 years. The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers that took several minutes for Judge Herrera to quiet with her walnut gavel. Spectators who had driven hundreds of miles to witness this moment embraced each other with the joy of people who had seen justice finally triumph over injustice. While reporters frantically scribbled notes and photographers captured images that would appear on front pages across the country. But Judge Herrera wasn't finished. Her ruling went beyond simply returning Standing Bear's original 3 acres to Nalin's ownership. It recognized the full extent of his original land grant, encompassing nearly 8,000 acres of high desert rangeland that was currently being used as pasture for Buck Morrison's cattle operations. Furthermore, the judge continued, I find that the defendant Morrison has been in illegal possession of federal railroad right-of-way property, and I am ordering the immediate cessation of all commercial activities on said property pending resolution with federal authorities. The court is also ordering the defendant to pay restitution for the fair market value of land use going back 20 years, the maximum period allowed under state law. The financial implications were staggering. 8,000 acres of New Mexico rangeland, valued at current market rates for agricultural property with development potential, represented millions of dollars in restored wealth. The restitution for illegal use of federal railroad property could reach into the tens of millions once federal prosecutors finished calculating a century of unpaid lease, fees and back taxes. Buck Morrison's face had gone chalk, white as the reality of his legal defeat settled over him like a burial shroud. His lawyers sat in stunned silence, apparently as shocked by the comprehensiveness of their loss as everyone else in the courtroom. This wasn't just a defeat, it was complete annihilation of everything the Morrison family had built through generations of fraud and corruption. But the judge's most significant ruling addressed the broader implications of the conspiracy that Maria Santos had uncovered. Judge Herrera ordered the creation of a special commission to investigate similar land frauds throughout northern New Mexico, with authority to recommend additional prosecutions and property restorations for other families who had been victimized by the same network of corrupt officials and unscrupulous speculators. This court finds that the evidence presented demonstrates a pattern of systematic fraud that extends far beyond the specific case before us today, Judge Herrera declared, her words carrying implications that would reshape land ownership disputes throughout the region. Justice delayed is not justice denied when the delay is caused by the defendant's own criminal actions and subsequent cover-up efforts. The celebration outside the courthouse was like nothing Esperanza had ever seen. Representatives from dozens of Native American communities joined local supporters and media representatives in an impromptu festival that spilled into the streets around the small-town courthouse. Traditional drums appeared from somewhere, along with Apache, Navajo, and Pueblo singers who offered songs of gratitude and victory that had been passed down through generations who had never expected to see such complete vindication. Thomas Crow Feather stood with his arms around Nalin and Tazhi, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he spoke words of blessing in Apache that most of the crowd couldn't understand, but everyone could feel. "Standing Bear's spirit is free now," he whispered to Nalin in English. "He can finally rest, knowing that his family's honor has been restored and his sacrifice was not in vain." Tazhi, overwhelmed by the crowd and the magnitude of what had just happened, pressed close to his mother's side as reporters and well-wishers surrounded them with congratulations and requests for interviews. At 8 years old, he couldn't fully comprehend the legal and financial implications of Judge Herrera's ruling, but he understood that something momentous had occurred, that the struggle which had defined their lives for the past year had finally ended in victory. "Does this mean the angry man can't hurt us anymore?" he asked his mother as they made their way through the celebrating crowd toward their old pickup truck. "It means a lot of things, me Joe," Nalin replied, lifting him up so he could see over the heads of the people who had gathered to share in their triumph. "But mostly it means that your great-great-great-grandfather can finally rest in peace, knowing that his family's name has been cleared and his land has come home." As they drove through the high desert toward the Adobe house that was now legally and unquestionably theirs, Nalin felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond legal victory or financial compensation. Standing Bear's war lance, the sacred eagle feather, the medicine pouch, and all the other artifacts that had connected her to her ancestral heritage had served their purpose. The circle of justice that had been broken in 1885 was finally complete. Buck Morrison's bitter departure from the courthouse, surrounded by his devastated legal team and facing the probability of federal criminal charges, marked the end of an era of impunity that had lasted for over a century. The empire built on stolen land and forged documents was collapsing. But something more valuable was being restored: the truth about what had really happened to the Apache families who had trusted American promises and been betrayed by American greed. As the lights of Esperanza faded in their rearview mirror and the stars began to emerge in the clear desert sky, Nalin understood that their real victory wasn't measured in acres or dollars. Their victory was measured in the knowledge that sometimes, if you're patient enough and brave enough and stubborn enough, justice really can find its way home. The new family portrait was taken 6 months after Judge Herrera's ruling, on a morning when the high desert light painted everything in shades of gold and hope. Nalin and Tazhi stood in front of their fully restored adobe house, its thick walls gleaming with fresh plaster and its roof crowned with traditional vigas that would shelter another generation of dreams. Behind them, the 8,000 acres that had been returned to their family stretched toward mountains that seemed close enough to touch in the clear New Mexico air. The transformation had been remarkable in ways that went far beyond the legal victory. The adobe house, once a pile of ruins that nobody wanted for any price, now stood as a testament to what could be accomplished when patience and determination refused to accept that broken things couldn't be made whole. Every room told a story of careful restoration. From the kitchen, where a traditional horno once again baked bread and fired pottery, to the bedrooms where hand-carved furniture waited to welcome visitors who came to hear the story of Standing Bear's vindication. Tazhi had grown taller and more confident in the months since the court victory, his young shoulders no longer carrying the weight of uncertainty about his family's place in the world. At 9 years old, he moved through their restored home with the natural authority of someone who belonged exactly where he was, who understood that the land beneath his feet was his birthright rather than his burden. The scholarship fund that Nalin had established with a portion of the restitution money was already changing lives throughout the Southwest. The Standing Bear Education Foundation provided full college scholarships for Native American students who demonstrated academic excellence and commitment to preserving tribal cultures, ensuring that future generations would have the tools needed to protect their communities from the kind of legal theft that had victimized their ancestors. Education is the best revenge, Nalin had said during the foundation's inaugural ceremony, standing before an audience of tribal leaders, educators, and students who represented the hope of their peoples. Standing Bear understood that knowledge was power, that documentation was protection, that preserving truth was the only way to ensure justice. These scholarships will give young people the weapons they need to fight for their families and communities in courtrooms and universities and government offices where the real battles for our future will be. 1. The cultural center that Thomas Crow Feather had helped design occupied, a new building constructed with traditional methods on the eastern edge of Nalin's restored property. Its exhibits told the complete story of Apache resistance and survival, from the free-roaming days of the 1800s through the reservation period to the modern struggles for sovereignty and self-determination. But the centerpiece of the center was Standing Bear's story. told through the documents and artifacts that had waited over a century for someone brave enough to demand justice. Visitors came from across the country to see the evidence that had toppled the Morrison Empire, and to hear Thomas Crow Feather's presentations about the systematic theft of indigenous land throughout the territorial period. School groups, university researchers, and tribal delegations made regular pilgrimages to the cultural center, drawn by the power of a story that proved truth really could triumph over corruption when the right person was willing to fight for it. Buck Morrison's empire had collapsed even more completely than anyone had predicted. Federal prosecutors, armed with evidence of systematic fraud dating back to the 1880s, had filed criminal charges that resulted in prison sentences for Morrison and 3 of his business associates. The forfeiture proceedings had stripped the family of virtually all their assets, which were being used to compensate the victims of the land fraud conspiracy and to restore illegally acquired federal property to government control. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of Morrison's downfall was the discovery that his family's carefully cultivated reputation as pillars of the community had been built on foundations even shakier than their legal land claims. Investigation into their business practices revealed a pattern of tax evasion, environmental violations, and labor law infractions that suggested the same contempt for legal authority that had characterized their ancestors' original crimes. What goes around comes around. Thomas Crow Feather had observed with the satisfaction of someone who had lived long enough to see justice finally catch up with injustice. Standing Bear always said that truth was like water. You could dam it up for a while, but eventually it would find a way around whatever obstacles people put in its path. Maria Santos had used the publicity from Nalin's case to launch a legal practice specializing in indigenous land rights, with offices in Santa Fe, Phoenix, and Denver that served tribal communities throughout the Southwest. The precedent established by Judge Herrera's ruling had already resulted in successful challenges to dozens of other questionable land transfers, returning millions of acres to tribal and individual native ownership. Nalin's victory opened a door that had been closed for over a century, Maria said during a legal conference devoted to indigenous land rights. But more importantly, it proved that our legal system is still capable of correcting historical injustices when presented with clear evidence and moral courage. Every family that was robbed, every community that was cheated, every ancestor who died, knowing that justice had been denied, they all have hope now, because one Apache woman refused to accept that 50 cents was the fair price for her family's dignity. The community of Esperanza had also been transformed by the case and its aftermath. The town that had once treated Nalin with suspicion and condescension now took pride in being the place where such an important victory for justice had been won. Rosa Sandoval's cafe had become an unofficial museum, with photographs and newspaper clippings documenting the legal battle that had captivated the nation and inspired similar struggles throughout Indian country. Local businesses that had initially shunned Nalin now competed to claim association with her story, understanding that the international media attention had brought tourism and economic development that the struggling town desperately needed. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who remembered the early days when residents had questioned whether social services should intervene to protect Tazhi from his mother's foolish obsession with old documents and family stories. As evening approached and the photographer finished capturing images for the family portrait that would hang in the cultural center alongside Standing Bear's century-old photograph, Nalin found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment of quiet triumph. The 50 cents that had purchased a pile of Adobe ruins had been transformed into something far more valuable than money. It had become proof that broken places really could hold the greatest treasures, that justice delayed was not always justice denied, and that sometimes the most important battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. standing in the courtyard where she and Tazhi had first slept under the stars, surrounded by walls that now sheltered not just their family, but the hopes of everyone who believed in the possibility of redemption. Nalin felt Joseph's presence as strongly as if he were standing beside her. He would have been proud of what they had accomplished, proud of the way their son had grown strong and confident in the knowledge of who he was and where he came from. The sun was setting behind the Sangre de Cristo mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and purple that seemed to celebrate the completion of a journey that had begun with grief and ended with restoration. As mother and son sat together on the front porch of their Adobe home, watching the daily miracle of desert twilight transform the landscape into something magical, Nalin understood that their real treasure had never been the Spanish silver or the valuable artifacts hidden beneath their floorboards. Their real treasure was this moment, this sense of belonging to land that belonged to them, this knowledge that Standing Bear's sacrifice had finally been vindicated, this certainty that some things really were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The broken place had indeed held the greatest treasure, but the treasure hadn't been coins or documents or legal vindication. The treasure had been the discovery that home wasn't a building or a piece of property. Home was where your ancestors' spirits could rest in peace, where your children could grow up knowing they were part of something larger than themselves, where justice and honor mattered more than comfort and security. As the first stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Nalin pulled her son close and whispered the words that Standing Bear's wife had probably spoken to their children on nights like this, more than a century ago. Never forget where you come from, mijo. Never forget that you carry the hopes and dreams of everyone who came before you. And never ever let anyone convince you that your family's honor is for sale at any price. The broken places had been made whole at last.